Samuel McCready wiped the sweat from his forehead as he looked across his struggling ranch in the Arizona Territory. The year was 1878, and drought had been punishing the land for 3 months straight. His cattle were thin, his water wells were running low, and his dreams of becoming a wealthy rancher seemed to slip away with each passing day. The Irish immigrant had come west 5 years ago with nothing but determination and a small inheritance from his father. He bought 500 acres of what seemed like promising grazing land, but the harsh desert climate proved more challenging than he ever imagined. While other ranchers in the territory were making fortunes, Samuel watched his savings disappear into the unforgiving earth. On this particular morning, Samuel was mending a broken fence when he spotted a dust cloud approaching from the east. 3 riders emerged from the heat shimmer, their horses moving at a steady pace toward his property. As they drew closer, Samuel recognized the lead rider as Jake Morrison, a trader who dealt in livestock and supplies throughout the territory. Morrison was known for his questionable business practices, but he always seemed to have what people needed when they were desperate. Morrison dismounted with a wide grin that didn't reach his eyes. His 2 companions remained on horseback, their hands resting casually near their gun belts. Samuel had seen men like these before, the kind who solved problems with violence rather than words. "Sam McCready," Morrison called out, extending his hand. "Heard you've been having some troubles with this drought." Samuel shook the offered hand cautiously. "Nothing I can't handle," he replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Morrison chuckled and gestured toward the barren landscape. "This land's been dry for months, and I hear tell your cattle are dropping faster than autumn leaves, but I might have something that could turn your fortunes around." The trader reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small leather pouch. The contents clinked softly as he shook it, and Samuel caught a glimpse of gold coins inside. His eyes widened despite himself. "Gold?" Samuel asked, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. "Apache gold," Morrison said with satisfaction. "Took it off some warriors who won't be needing it anymore. But that's not the real prize I'm offering you." Samuel's stomach tightened. He had heard stories about Morrison's dealings with the Apache, and none of them painted the trader in a favorable light. The Apache had been fighting to protect their ancestral lands, and men like Morrison profited from the conflict. Morrison continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There's an Apache camp about 2 days' ride north of here. Small group, maybe 15 people total. Word is they've got something valuable, real valuable, worth more than all the gold in this pouch." "What kind of valuable?" Samuel found himself asking, even though part of him didn't want to know the answer. "That's where you come in, partner. I need someone with a legitimate ranch, someone who can provide cover for a little business venture. You help me with this one job, and I'll split whatever we find with you 50-50. Could be enough to save your ranch and set you up for life." Samuel looked around his property, the dying cattle, the cracked earth, the house that needed repairs he couldn't afford. His Irish pride wanted to tell Morrison to leave, but his practical mind calculated how long his remaining money would last. Maybe 2 months, 3 if he was careful. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Samuel asked. Morrison's grin widened. "Nothing too complicated. We ride up there, make contact with the Apache, and conduct a little trade. They've got something we want, we've got something they need. Simple business transaction." The trader's companions exchanged glances that made Samuel uneasy. These men didn't look like they were planning a peaceful trade negotiation. "And if they don't want to trade?" Samuel pressed. "Oh, they'll trade," Morrison said confidently. "Apache are practical people. They know when they're outnumbered and outgunned." Samuel felt his chest tighten. Morrison was talking about intimidation, possibly violence, against people who were already struggling to survive in a changing world. The Apache had been pushed off most of their traditional lands, forced to live in increasingly smaller areas while settlers like himself claimed territory that had been theirs for generations. But Samuel also thought about his own survival. He had worked so hard to build something in this harsh land, and now it was all slipping away. His father had died working in the coal mines of Pennsylvania, dreaming of a better life for his son. Samuel had promised himself he would never go back to that kind of poverty. "What kind of timeline are we talking about?" Samuel asked, hating himself for even considering the proposition. "We leave at dawn tomorrow. Be back within a week. Quick and clean." Morrison reached back into his saddlebag and pulled out a Winchester rifle, newer and better than the old Springfield Samuel owned. "Consider this an advance payment. You'll need decent firepower where we're going." Samuel took the rifle, feeling its weight in his hands. The metal was cold, despite the desert heat, and he could smell the gun oil used to keep it in perfect condition. This was a weapon meant for killing, not hunting game or protecting livestock from predators. "Think it over tonight," Morrison said, mounting his horse. "But don't think too long. Opportunity like this doesn't come around often, and I've got other partners I could approach." As the three riders disappeared into the distance, Samuel stood alone in his failing ranch, holding the rifle and staring at the gold coins Morrison had left on his fence post. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like the oppressive desert heat. That evening, Samuel sat on his porch, cleaning the Winchester and trying to convince himself that Morrison's plan might be legitimate. Maybe the Apache did want to trade. Maybe they had surplus goods they were willing to exchange for supplies they needed. Maybe he was worrying about nothing. But deep in his heart, Samuel knew better. He had seen Morrison operate before, had heard the stories whispered in saloons about his methods. The trader didn't make deals. He took what he wanted and left others to deal with the consequences. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Samuel made his choice. He needed that money, needed it more than his conscience could bear. Tomorrow, he would ride north with Morrison and his men, telling himself that he was just trying to survive in a harsh world. The Apache camp they were planning to visit had no idea that 4 armed men were planning to take whatever they considered valuable. They had no way of knowing that Samuel McCready, a struggling Irish rancher, was about to make a decision that would change multiple lives forever. In the distance, a coyote howled into the gathering darkness, and Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that it sounded like a warning. The 4 riders reached the Apache camp just as the morning sun climbed over the eastern mountains. Samuel's stomach had been churning for the entire 2-day journey, but Morrison and his men seemed relaxed, almost eager for what lay ahead. They had tracked the small band of Apache to a sheltered canyon, where a thin stream provided water and some protection from the desert winds. Samuel counted exactly 15 people in the camp, just as Morrison had predicted. Most were women, children, and elderly men, not the fierce warriors that stories and newspapers usually described. They lived in simple brush shelters and appeared to be surviving on very little. Their horses were thin, their clothing worn, and Samuel could see that they were struggling just as much as he was, perhaps more. "Remember the plan?" Morrison whispered as they approached. "We stay mounted, keep our weapons visible, and make it clear we're not here to socialize. You let me do the talking." An elderly Apache man emerged from the largest shelter and walked toward them with dignity, despite the obvious disparity in firepower. His weathered face showed no fear, only a resigned wariness that spoke of too many encounters with armed white men. He raised his hand in a gesture that could have been greeting or surrender. Morrison spurred his horse forward and spoke in broken Apache mixed with Spanish and English. "We come for trade. Here you have something valuable. We make good deal." The elderly man, who seemed to be the camp's leader, responded in careful English. "We have little to trade. Food is scarce. Water is precious." "What do you want?" "Not food, not water. Morrison's voice carried an edge of impatience. "We want the woman, the one who is not Apache." Samuel felt his blood turn cold. Morrison hadn't mentioned anything about a woman. This wasn't about Apache gold or valuable goods. This was about human trafficking. The elderly Apache's face hardened. "There is no woman here for white men." Morrison laughed, but it was an ugly sound. "Don't play games with me, old man. We know you've got her. Young woman, maybe 20 years old, captured from a Mexican village 6 months ago. Worth good money to the right buyer." Samuel's hands tightened on his rifle as the horrible truth became clear. Morrison wasn't here to trade for goods or gold. He was here to buy a human being who had already been sold into slavery once. The valuable prize was a woman who had been taken from her home and was now being treated as property to be bought and sold. "We do not sell people," the Apache leader said firmly. "The woman stays with us. She is under our protection." "Protection?" Morrison spat. "You mean she's your prisoner, and prisoners can change hands if the price is right." One of Morrison's men, a thin, scarred gunfighter named Dutch, moved his hand closer to his pistol. "Maybe we should stop asking politely, Jake." Samuel watched in growing horror as the situation escalated. Women and children in the camp began moving toward the back of the canyon, sensing the danger. The few Apache men present stepped forward to stand with their leader, but they were clearly outnumbered and outgunned. "Wait," Samuel said, his voice cracking slightly. "Maybe we should reconsider this whole thing." Morrison turned in his saddle to glare at him. "Getting cold feet, Irish? Remember what you stand to gain here." But Samuel was looking past Morrison now, his attention caught by movement near one of the brush shelters. A young woman had emerged, and she was clearly not Apache. She appeared to be Mexican, with long, dark hair and clothing that was a mixture of Apache and Mexican styles. Even from a distance, Samuel could see that she moved with the careful wariness of someone who had learned to expect violence from armed men. The woman approached the elderly Apache leader and spoke to him quietly in what sounded like Apache language. Samuel was surprised. If she had only been with them for 6 months, she had learned their language remarkably quickly. "There she is," Morrison said with satisfaction. "Maria Esperanza, taken from a village near Tucson. Her family's probably dead, but she's young and healthy, worth at least $200 to the right buyer." Samuel felt sick. This wasn't a business transaction. This was the sale of a human being who had already survived one traumatic capture. The thought of his own desperate financial situation suddenly seemed insignificant compared to what this woman had endured. "The girl chooses to stay," the Apache leader announced. "She is free to leave when she wishes. She chooses to remain." "That's not how this works," Morrison replied coldly. He gestured to his men, and they spread out to better surround the small group of Apache. "We're offering good payment. Gold coin. Enough to buy supplies for your whole camp." Morrison pulled out a larger pouch than the one he had shown Samuel, and the sound of coins was clearly audible. Samuel realized that the trader had been planning this specific transaction all along. The pouch he had shown at the ranch was just bait to recruit Samuel as an accomplice. The young woman stepped forward and spoke in accented but clear English. "I will not go with you. I choose to stay with these people who showed me kindness when others showed me only cruelty." Her voice was steady, but Samuel could see the fear in her eyes. She had learned enough about men like Morrison to know exactly what fate awaited her if she was sold again. "You don't get to choose," Dutch said with a nasty grin. "You're property, girl. Property goes to whoever pays the most." That was when the elderly Apache leader made his decision. He spoke a few sharp words in his own language, and suddenly the women and children began moving more urgently toward the back of the canyon. The Apache men formed a loose line between Morrison's group and the rest of their people. "You will leave now," the leader said with quiet dignity. "Take your gold. We have nothing to sell." Morrison's patience finally snapped. "We're not leaving empty-handed. Dutch, Carlos, get the woman. The old man can watch his people die if he wants to be stubborn about this." Samuel watched in horror as Morrison's men drew their weapons. This was exactly what he had feared would happen, but somehow he had convinced himself that Morrison would find a way to make a peaceful deal. Now he was about to become an accessory to violence against people who were only trying to protect someone under their care. "Stop!" Samuel shouted, surprising everyone, including himself. "This isn't what we agreed to." "It's exactly what we agreed to," Morrison snarled. "You want your ranch saved or not?" Samuel looked around the camp, at the elderly leader standing protectively in front of his people, at the young woman who had chosen to stay with those who treated her with kindness rather than as property, at the children hiding behind their mothers. These people were fighting for survival and dignity just like he was, but they were doing it without sacrificing their humanity. "I want my ranch saved," Samuel said slowly, "but not like this." He raised his rifle, but instead of pointing it at the Apache, he aimed it at Morrison. "We're leaving, now, all of us." Morrison stared at him in disbelief. "You're making a big mistake, Irish, a very expensive mistake." "Maybe," Samuel replied, his hands surprisingly steady, "but it's my mistake to make." The standoff lasted for several tense seconds before Morrison realized that Samuel was serious. With 3-to-1 odds, suddenly reduced to 2 against 2, and facing people who were fighting to protect their freedom rather than just seeking profit, Morrison decided that discretion was the better part of valor. "This isn't over," Morrison said as he turned his horse away from the camp. "You'll regret this when you're watching your cattle die and your land gets sold for taxes." As the 3 riders disappeared into the desert, Samuel remained behind for a moment. The elderly Apache leader approached him cautiously. "Why did you help us?" he asked in his careful English. Samuel looked around the camp one more time, at the people who had been willing to risk their lives to protect someone who had already suffered so much. "Because some things are worth more than money," he said finally. The young woman named Maria stepped forward. "Thank you," she said simply. "You saved my life." Samuel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had probably just condemned his ranch and his dreams of prosperity, but for the first time in months he felt like he could look at himself in the mirror without shame. As he rode away toward his struggling ranch, Samuel didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew that whatever happened, he would face it with his conscience intact. 3 days after returning from the Apache camp, Samuel sat on his porch watching his cattle grow thinner as the drought continued its relentless assault on his land. He had spent the time since his return working on ranch repairs and trying not to think about his dwindling bank account. Morrison's words echoed in his mind. He would regret his decision when the bank came to collect on his mortgage. Samuel was mending harness leather when he spotted a lone rider approaching from the north. At first, he thought Morrison had returned to make another attempt at recruiting him, but as the figure drew closer, he realized it was the young Mexican woman from the Apache camp. She rode alone on a paint horse, with a simple bundle of possessions tied behind her saddle. Maria Esperanza dismounted near his porch and approached cautiously. She wore the same mixture of Apache and Mexican clothing he had seen before, but now she also carried herself with a confidence that hadn't been visible during the tense confrontation 3 days earlier. "Mr. McCready," she said in her accented English, "I have come to speak with you." Samuel set down his leather work and stood up. "Miss Esperanza, what brings you all the way out here? Is everything all right at the camp?" "The camp is safe. The Apache moved to winter grounds in the mountains yesterday. They will be safe from men like Morrison there." "And you? Why didn't you go with them?" Maria looked around the struggling ranch, taking in the thin cattle and the obvious signs of financial hardship. "I chose not to go with them because I have a proposition for you." Samuel gestured toward a chair on the porch. I'm listening. Maria sat down, but maintained her straight posture, speaking with the careful formality of someone who had learned to negotiate for survival. I know your ranch is failing. I saw this when Morrison brought you to our camp. The Apache told me you refused payment to protect me. This was a great sacrifice. It wasn't about money, Samuel said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. But it was about money, Maria replied gently. You needed Morrison's payment to save your ranch. Instead, you chose to do what was right. This tells me you are a good man, but it also tells me you are now in worse trouble than before. Samuel couldn't argue with her logic. His brief moment of heroism had probably cost him everything he had worked to build in Arizona. Maria continued. I have skills that could help your ranch survive. In Mexico, before I was taken, my family raised cattle and horses. I know how to find water in dry country. I know which plants cattle can eat when grass is scarce. I know how to treat sick animals and how to make things grow in desert soil. You're offering to work here? Samuel asked, surprised. I am offering a partnership. You have land and cattle. I have knowledge and skills. Together, we might save your ranch and build something good. Samuel studied her face, trying to understand what she was really proposing. What would you want in return? I can't pay wages. I can barely afford to feed myself. I want a home, Maria said simply, not as property, not as a servant, but as a partner. I want to help build something that belongs to both of us. The proposal was unlike anything Samuel had expected. In 1878, Arizona, partnerships between white men and Mexican women were unusual, especially when they involved equal ownership of property. But then again, nothing about his situation was conventional anymore. Show me what you mean about finding water, Samuel said after a long pause. Maria smiled for the first time since arriving. She led him away from the ranch house toward a section of his property where he had given up hope of finding water. She walked slowly across the seemingly barren ground, occasionally kneeling to examine the soil or the few scattered plants that still showed signs of life. After 20 minutes of careful searching, she stopped near a cluster of cottonwood saplings that Samuel had barely noticed before. Here, she said confidently. Water is close to the surface here. Maybe 8 feet down, maybe 10. Samuel looked at the spot skeptically. He had tried digging wells in a dozen locations across his property, and every attempt had ended in disappointment and wasted effort. How can you be so sure? He asked. My grandfather taught me to read the land. These trees would not grow here if water was not close. The soil color is different here, darker with more clay. And see these tracks? She pointed to barely visible animal signs in the dirt. Javelinas come here regularly. They know where water can be found. Over the following week, Maria proved her knowledge repeatedly. She showed Samuel which of his cattle were sick and how to treat them with desert plants he had never noticed before. She identified areas where the soil could support drought-resistant crops that would provide both human food and cattle feed. Most importantly, she was right about the water. When they dug down 9 feet in the spot she had identified, clear water began seeping into the hole. It wasn't a gushing spring, but it was steady and clean, enough to keep his remaining cattle alive and provide a foundation for future growth. Where did you learn all this? Samuel asked as they rested beside their new well. My family lived on a ranch near the border for 3 generations. The land was harsh like this, but we made it work. My grandfather fought in the war against the Americans, but afterward he said the only way to survive was to learn from the land itself, not from other people's ideas about what the land should be. As they worked together over the next month, Samuel began to understand what Maria meant about partnership. She brought knowledge and skills that were perfectly suited to the harsh Arizona environment, while he provided the legal ownership and the basic infrastructure needed to build a successful ranch. More importantly, he began to understand her strength. Maria had survived capture, slavery, and the constant threat of being sold again, but she had never lost her ability to see possibilities for the future. While Samuel had been focusing on his failures and limitations, she saw opportunities and solutions. The drought finally broke in late October, with 3 days of steady rain. Samuel and Maria worked together to dig channels that would direct the precious water to areas where it would do the most good. They planted winter crops using seeds she had brought from the Apache camp, varieties that could survive with minimal water. By December, Samuel's ranch was beginning to show signs of real recovery. His cattle were gaining weight, his crops were growing, and his bank account had stabilized. More importantly, he had found something he hadn't expected when he first came to Arizona, a true partner who understood both the challenges and the possibilities of life in the desert. On Christmas Eve, 1878, Samuel and Maria stood together on the porch of what was now their shared ranch house, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. They had worked together for 4 months, and Samuel could no longer imagine managing the ranch without her knowledge and partnership. "Do you ever regret not taking Morrison's money?" Maria asked. Samuel thought about the question carefully. His ranch was successful now, but it had been built through hard work and collaboration rather than blood money. "Never," he said finally. "What we've built here is worth more than anything Morrison could have paid." "Even if we had failed? Even if we had lost everything?" "Especially then," Samuel replied. "Some prices are too high to pay, no matter how much you need the money." Maria nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. She had learned the same lesson through her own bitter experience with people who treated human dignity as a commodity to be bought and sold. As 1878 drew to a close, Samuel McCready had discovered that his greatest prize had never been the riches he expected from Morrison's scheme. Instead, it was the partnership he had found with a woman whose strength and knowledge had saved not only his ranch, but also his sense of what kind of man he wanted to be. The Apache who had protected Maria had taught her that true wealth came from relationships built on respect and mutual support, rather than exploitation and greed. Now she had taught the same lesson to an Irish rancher who had almost lost his way in the harsh realities of frontier life. Their ranch would continue to prosper in the years that followed, but more importantly, it would serve as proof that even in the violent and often brutal world of the American West, it was possible to build something good through partnership, respect, and the courage to do what was right even when it came at a personal cost.